April 7th, 1945. The first light of day broke over Tokyo Bay, turning the waters silver and the sky pale orange. From the ground, Japanese soldiers and civilians alike could hear the faint drone of engines in the distance. At first, most assumed it was another wave of B-29 bombers, massive American Superfortresses that had been firebombing Japan's cities for months. Those had become a grimly familiar sound. But for the young Japanese pilots waiting on airstrips outside the capital, what they saw climbing out of the haze stopped them cold. Through the early morning mist, streaking across the sky with a confidence that seemed impossible, came sleek silver fighters with long noses and broad wings. They were not carrier-based Navy planes, which the Japanese had learned to expect. These were single-engine fighters, American fighters, over Tokyo itself. For years, their commanders had assured them this was impossible. Japan's military leadership swore no American single-engine fighter could cross the vast Pacific waters and still have the fuel to fight over the home islands. They said it with certainty, and the young pilots had believed it. Yet here they were, P-51 Mustangs, the same fighters that had broken the Luftwaffe over Europe, now circling above the Japanese capital. The shock was instant and overwhelming. It wasn't just that enemy fighters had arrived, it was what their very presence meant. If America could put Mustangs in Tokyo's skies, then the ocean itself no longer protected Japan. One Japanese pilot would later recall the moment with a bitter laugh. "We thought the ocean was our shield. That morning, the shield broke." The first realization settled like a stone in their stomachs. These were not Navy planes flying from some carrier nearby. These Mustangs had come from Iwo Jima, nearly 750 miles away. And if the Americans could do this, what else could they do? The question hung in the minds of every man who looked up at the sky that morning. High above the Pacific, hours before Tokyo came into view, Major James B. M. Tapp sat in the cramped cockpit of his P-51 Mustang. His leather gloves tightened around the control stick, knuckles white against the early morning sun. He had been flying for nearly 3 hours already, nothing but endless ocean beneath him and a compass needle pointing the way. Each vibration of the Merlin engine reassured him, but every minute also reminded him of the razor's edge he and his squadron were balancing on. There were no alternate landing fields out here, no carriers waiting below. If his engine quit, the only destination was the cold Pacific. Yet here he was, leading 90 other Mustang pilots from Iwo Jima straight into the heart of the Japanese homeland. Behind them, still forming up, were the giants, the B-29 Superfortresses loaded with incendiaries, bound for Tokyo's factories and neighborhoods. For those bombers to survive, men like Tapp had to be the shield. He glanced at the wings, stretching out from his Mustang. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns sat locked and loaded, each with belts of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Nearly 2,000 rounds in total, waiting to unleash hell at the squeeze of a trigger. But in that cockpit, Tapp's mind wasn't on the numbers. It was on survival. He thought about the German Luftwaffe he had heard about from fellow pilots, how the Mustang had torn through the skies over Europe, breaking Hitler's air force. Now it was his turn, only this time the enemy wore the rising sun. As dawn broke behind Mount Fuji, the silver bombers began to appear, dozens, then hundreds, like floating fortresses of steel. And circling among them, almost protectively, were the Mustangs. Tapp could feel the weight of history in that moment. The Japanese had no idea America could reach this far, and that ignorance was about to shatter. With a steady hand, Tapp keyed his radio. "All right, boys, stick with your bombers. Keep your eyes open. Tokyo's ahead." The roar of the Merlin filled his ears as he eased the Mustang into position. He wasn't just flying an aircraft. He was carrying the message of American industry, ingenuity, and endurance straight to the enemy's capital. For him, the mission wasn't just about escorting B-29s. It was about proving to the Japanese people and to the world that there was nowhere America couldn't go. While Major Tapp and his fellow pilots droned toward Tokyo, thousands of miles away in Southern California, the story of their aircraft was being written in steel, rivets, and sweat. Inside the cavernous halls of North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood, the air smelled of oil, paint, and hot metal. The factory never slept. Day and night, under the glare of overhead lights, rows of women in coveralls and men in rolled-up sleeves bent over fuselage frames, engines, and wings. Every few minutes, the sharp bark of a rivet gun echoed across the floor. At the edge of one line, a young woman named Helen wiped her forehead with a bandana, then went back to guiding a rivet into place. In her lunch pail sat a half-finished Coca-Cola bottle she'd grabbed from the vending machine. A radio perched on a shelf above her played Bing Crosby's voice, cutting through the clatter of the plant. Helen had lost her brother in the Philippines in 1942. Every rivet she drove felt personal. Every Mustang rolling off the line was her answer to him, and her promise to the men now flying them over Japan. And those Mustangs were coming fast. The scale defied imagination. At peak wartime output, a brand new P-51D Mustang rolled off the assembly line every single hour. Midnight, dawn, lunchtime, it didn't matter. The factory never stopped. An engineer checking gauges on a newly mounted Packard-built Merlin engine could look at his watch, knowing that by this time tomorrow, this very plane might already be roaring over the Pacific, protecting bombers and hunting enemy fighters. The line between factory floor and battlefield had never been shorter. Meanwhile, workers joked, swapped sandwiches, and listened for the factory whistle. But all the while, they knew what they were doing mattered. Every bolt tightened in California meant one more pilot had a chance of coming home alive. The miracle wasn't just the machine, it was the system. America had transformed automobile plants into aircraft factories, turning out fighters, bombers, engines, and parts with a rhythm Germany and Japan simply couldn't match. Where the Axis powers built planes by the hundreds, America built them by the tens of thousands, and the Mustang symbolized it all. A sleek fighter born from American design and British engineering, powered by Detroit muscle and built by hands that had once made cars, washing machines, or nothing mechanical at all. In Tokyo, Japanese pilots were just beginning to realize what was coming for them. But in Inglewood, the workers already knew. They were sending a message overseas, one Mustang at a time. While workers in California were cranking out Mustangs with radios playing and bottles of Coca-Cola on the lunch table, a very different morning was unfolding in Japan. On the outskirts of Tokyo, a young Japanese pilot named Lieutenant Saito sat cross-legged on the floor of a drafty barracks. His breakfast was simple, a ball of rice, a small pickled plum, and a thin slice of sweet potato. It was all his unit could spare. Sugar had long since vanished from their diets, and real coffee was a memory from years before. He ate in silence, staring at the patched knees of his flight uniform. The once proud cloth now bore 3 repairs, stitched clumsily with whatever thread could be found. His boots were cracked, soles thinned from overuse. Around him, other pilots prepared in the same weary fashion, their voices low, their faces lined with fatigue that no one their age should have carried. Outside, his Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, known to the Allies as Frank, waited. On paper, it was one of Japan's best fighters, fast, maneuverable, heavily armed. But paper meant little in 1945. The engine was temperamental, built with poor quality steel rushed through bomb-damaged factories. The landing gear had been known to collapse without warning. Some planes never even made it off the runway. Saito knew this all too well. He had seen comrades killed not in battle but in accidents, struts snapping on landing, engines coughing themselves to death mid-flight. Each mission was a gamble, and today was no different. The ground crew moved cautiously around his plane. They were fueling it with gasoline of dubious quality, an 80-octane brew mixed with alcohol distilled from potatoes. Some even joked it smelled more like sake than aviation fuel. The Americans flew with 100-octane gas from Texas and California refineries. Saito flew with whatever could be scraped together. He climbed into the cockpit, the leather seat worn thin, instruments rattling. As he pressed the starter, the engine sputtered, coughed, then reluctantly roared to life. He exhaled, half relieved, half anxious. He knew it might fail at any moment. Looking east, he saw the rising sun breaking the horizon. Somewhere beyond that glow, the Americans were coming. B-29s, perhaps. Maybe Navy fighters. Whatever it was, they would have to meet it. He tightened his harness and muttered a prayer his father had taught him as a boy. Not a prayer for victory, just that the engine would hold long enough to get him back down again. In that moment, Saito's world stood in stark contrast to Helen's world in California. She riveted a Mustang with steady hands and a Coke beside her radio. He climbed into a machine stitched together with shortages, hoping it would not betray him. The battle that morning would not be just a clash of airplanes. It would be a collision of two completely different worlds. For all its sleek beauty, the P-51 Mustang was more than just a fighter. It was a triumph of engineering. Everything about it was designed with a single purpose: to take American air power farther than anyone thought possible. At the heart of it all was the engine. Early Mustangs had been underpowered with Allison engines, fine for low altitudes but gasping for breath in the thin air above 20,000 feet. Then came the partnership that changed aviation history, a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, mass-produced under license by Packard in Detroit. With 1,700 horsepower and a two-stage supercharger, it gave the Mustang the lungs to breathe at 30,000 feet, while Japanese engines choked and sputtered. It wasn't just about power, it was about range. The Mustang carried drop tanks, slim auxiliary fuel tanks slung under the wings that let it fly more than 1,500 miles round trip. That meant a Mustang could take off from Iwo Jima, escort bombers to Tokyo, dogfight enemy fighters, and still make it back. To put that in perspective, Japanese fighter doctrine had been built around short-range interceptors. Their aircraft could sprint into the sky, fight for minutes, and then return to base. The Mustang could loiter for hours, keeping watch like a hawk. And then there was the wing. Engineers at North American Aviation had designed what was called a laminar flow wing, shaped to keep air smooth over a larger surface area. It reduced drag by more than a third compared to older designs. That meant greater speed, greater efficiency, and less fuel burned. Numbers tell the story. At altitude, the P-51 could hit 440 miles per hour. It could climb to more than 40,000 feet, and it could do it all with 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 on the inboard mounts with 500 rounds each, and 2 on the outboard with 270 rounds apiece. In total, 1,880 rounds of high-velocity, armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, enough to chew through Japanese fighters or even a bomber with just a few bursts. But the real marvel was what all this meant for strategy. Just 2 years earlier, American planners had dismissed the idea of sending single-engine fighters on missions hundreds of miles over the ocean. If an engine failed, the pilot was lost. If the navigation was off, the squadron might vanish into empty seas. Yet, here the Mustang was, defying that logic, escorting the largest bombers in the world into the skies above Japan's capital. Meanwhile, back in Tokyo, Lieutenant Saito gritted his teeth as his own Ki-84 rattled on the runway. Its engine boasted 2,000 horsepower on paper, but with poor steel and low-grade fuel, it was a gamble every time it turned over. He had no illusions about the comparison. He could fly bravely, even skillfully, but his machine was already one step behind. The Mustang wasn't just another fighter. It was the embodiment of America's industrial advantage, a perfect balance of speed, firepower, and range that no Axis nation could match. And on this April morning, that advantage was about to arrive in force over Tokyo. As Major Tapp and his men approached the rendezvous point, the horizon began to shimmer with sunlight flashing off polished aluminum. At first it looked like a haze, a trick of the dawn, but soon the shapes sharpened. Massive wings, 4 engines apiece, moving in perfect deliberate formations. The B-29 Superfortresses had arrived. To the pilots watching from below, it was like seeing a miracle. More than 100 of the largest bombers in the world circling slowly in the morning light, their silver skins catching the sun. From the cockpit of his Mustang, Tap could only marvel at the sight. Later, one of his fellow pilots would say, "They looked like a school of giant silver fish swimming through the sky." Each of those bombers carried tons of incendiaries, enough to set entire districts of Tokyo ablaze. But their true strength was not just their payload, it was the message of industrial might they represented. Each B-29 had been built with more than 100,000 parts, assembled in factories that dwarfed anything the Japanese had ever seen. America wasn't just sending airplanes to war, it was sending factories, assembly lines, and the entire weight of a nation's industry. The Japanese pilots scrambling to intercept that morning didn't know what to make of it. They had been told the Americans couldn't escort their bombers this far. They had been told the B-29s would be vulnerable, easy prey. Instead, as they climbed through the haze, what they saw left them speechless. Swarms of Mustangs weaving among the bomber stream, every silver fortress shadowed by sleek fighters ready to strike. Lieutenant Saito, gripping his trembling control stick, felt his chest tighten. He had trained to fight bombers, to dive on lumbering giants, but these were not unescorted targets. The Americans had brought a weapon he had been told would never appear above Tokyo, the Mustang. He watched as they darted in and out of the bomber formations, alert, aggressive, their Merlin engines singing at full throttle. In that moment, he understood what his commanders would never admit. The ocean was no longer a barrier. The Japanese homeland, once believed untouchable, was now within easy reach of the enemy. And the day's fight had only just begun. The Japanese interceptors came climbing out of the haze, engines straining, wings glinting in the sunlight. To the American pilots, it was as if hornets had been shaken from a nest. Dozens of them. Nakajima Ki 84. Franks, older Ki 43 Oscars, and a scattering of others, clawed for altitude, desperate to break through to the bomber stream. Lieutenant Saito gritted his teeth and pulled his Ki-84 into a steep climb. On paper, his aircraft could outturn and outclimb the Mustang at certain altitudes. His instructors had drilled it into him: use agility, strike quickly, then disengage. He spotted the silver wing of a Mustang ahead and pushed the throttle forward. The Hayate's radial engine screamed as he closed the distance. For one brief moment he thought he had the advantage. The American seemed unaware, straight and level, the perfect target. But the Mustang was no easy prey. Major Tap had been watching his mirrors. As Saito lined up his shot, Tap rolled his P-51 over and yanked hard on the stick. The laminar flow wing bit into the air, the Merlin roared, and in an instant the Mustang was on the offensive. The two fighters spiraled toward each other, tracers flashing through the sky. Saito fired first, his 20mm cannon belching flame, but his rounds sailed wide. Tap's reply was brutally efficient. 6 Browning 50s opening up in unison. In less than 3 seconds, 80 rounds tore through the sky, armor-piercing incendiary slugs striking Saito's wing and engine cowling. The Japanese fighter burst into flames, shedding pieces as it rolled helplessly away. Elsewhere, the pattern repeated. Japanese pilots dove into the formation, only to find Mustangs waiting, turning the ambush against them. The sky above Tokyo filled with twisting contrails, flashes of gunfire, and burning wrecks spiraling down. American pilots had been taught not to turn with Japanese fighters, but to use speed, altitude, and firepower. They slashed in and out, never giving their opponents time to recover. Each time a Mustang's gun spoke, another enemy plane vanished in smoke and flame. For the Japanese pilots, it was bewildering. They had been told the Americans could never reach Tokyo with fighters. They had been told their Hayates and Oscars could handle anything the US could build. But this morning, all those assurances shattered in the gunfire of the Mustang's Brownings. Lieutenant Saito never knew what hit him. In the chaos, his last thought was not of glory or victory, but of disbelief. How had the enemy come so far, so fast? The answer was roaring past him at 400 miles an hour, silver wings flashing in the sun. The sound of 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns firing in unison was unlike anything else in the skies of World War II. Pilots described it as a deep, ripping growl, a chainsaw of thunder that seemed to tear the air itself apart. Each P-51 Mustang carried nearly 1,900 rounds of ammunition. At full squeeze, those Brownings spat out 80 bullets every second. Armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer, round after round stitched the sky in a brilliant, lethal stream. It didn't take long for the math to sink in. A Japanese fighter like the Ki-84 Frank carried just 2 20mm cannons and a pair of 12.7mm machine guns. Powerful weapons, yes, but they were limited by small magazines and poor ammunition quality. A Hayate might have 350 or 400 rounds total. Once fired, the pilot had to break off. The Mustang, by contrast, could keep shooting. Its belts of ammunition let a pilot fire for 30 full seconds before running dry, an eternity in aerial combat. And when those 50 caliber slugs hit, they tore through wings, fuselages, and engines with brutal efficiency. One burst could rip a Japanese plane in half. Veteran pilots understood the difference immediately. American aces learned not to waste ammo in long sprays. Instead, they waited, lined up carefully, then unleashed a 2 or 3 second burst. That was all it took. At 300 yards, the concentration of fire was enough to saw through an enemy aircraft as if it were made of paper. For Japanese pilots, it was a nightmare. They could dodge 1 Mustang, maybe even 2, but once a squadron locked on, the volume of lead in the air became overwhelming. No amount of skill or bravery could change the arithmetic. The contrast was staggering. In 1945, while American factories were turning out millions of rounds of high-grade 50 caliber ammunition every week, Japan's supply lines were crumbling. Ground crews sometimes rationed bullets as carefully as they rationed fuel. A pilot might take off with only half his magazines filled, ordered to conserve every shot. But the Mustang pilots were never told to conserve. They were told to finish the fight. That morning over Tokyo, the math played out in brutal clarity. A dozen Japanese fighters attacked the bomber stream. Minutes later, half of them were gone, shot down, scattered, or limping back to airfields that barely had fuel to recover them. The Mustangs remained, circling confidently, their guns still hot, their magazines still heavy. It was more than technology. It was more than tactics. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was entirely American. Back on the ground, far from the swirling dogfights above Tokyo, the cracks in Japan's war machine were plain for anyone to see. In a factory outside Nagoya, workers struggled to keep the Nakajima production lines moving. The floor was dim, lit by a few weak bulbs powered by an unreliable grid. Bomb damage had cut electricity so often that some machines were powered by hand cranks and bicycle pedals. Women and schoolboys hammered out parts with tools their fathers once used for farm work. Engines built here were sent to the front, but pilots knew better than to trust them. Cheap steel cracked under stress, bearings seized. Even fresh from the factory, many engines had to be torn down and rebuilt before they could fly. Fuel was worse. Japan's once proud Air Force now relied on gasoline of such poor quality that pilots joked it was closer to moonshine than aviation fuel. Refineries mixed in alcohol from potatoes, even pine oil. It was corrosive, inefficient, and dangerous. Engines coughed black smoke, sputtered in mid-flight, and often failed outright. Lieutenant Saito had lived this reality for months. More than once, his squadron launched with half their planes grounded for lack of spare parts. Pilots carried orders to conserve ammunition, sometimes taking off with their magazines only half filled, and even when they flew, they were told to avoid prolonged fights. Gasoline was too precious. Every gallon burned over Tokyo was a gallon lost for the defense of Okinawa or Kyushu. The numbers painted a grim picture. By 1945, Japan produced just a fraction of the aircraft it once had. Many never reached combat. Others rolled off the assembly line unfinished, waiting for parts that never came. In total, fewer than 3,500 Ki-84 Hayates were built during the entire war. By contrast, in a single year, American factories produced more Mustangs than that. The human toll was visible everywhere. Pilots grew thinner by the month. Meals shrank from rice and fish to potatoes and millet. Uniforms were patched and repatched, helmets dented, parachutes reused long past their safe limit. And yet, despite the shortages, despite the fatigue, they were still ordered into the sky to face Mustangs built with the best steel, fueled with the best gasoline, and flown by men who knew they had a factory army standing behind them. For Saito, and for thousands like him, it was not just a fight against American pilots. It was a fight against time, exhaustion, and inevitability. Each morning began with prayer. Each evening ended with losses. As the smoke of burning aircraft drifted across Tokyo that day, the truth was clear. Japan's strength was spent. The empire could not replace what it lost, and the Americans, with their endless assembly lines, seemed only to grow stronger with every passing week. While Japanese pilots prayed their engines would start and their fuel wouldn't give out, life in America looked entirely different. In Dallas, at the sprawling North American aviation plant, the assembly line kept moving like clockwork. Men and women in coveralls riveted panels, tested radios, and bolted on wings. Overhead, banners hung with slogans, "Keep 'em flying," and "More planes, sooner." At lunchtime, workers sat on benches outside, unwrapping sandwiches stacked with meat, drinking Coca-Cola from glass bottles, and lighting cigarettes without a second thought. If they didn't finish a sandwich, it was tossed away. To them, it was ordinary. To a Japanese pilot like Lieutenant Saito, it would have looked like impossible wealth. The numbers told the story better than anything else. By 1944, American factories were producing more than 15,000 aircraft every month. In that single year, more than 8,000 P-51D Mustangs rolled off the lines, more fighters than Japan could build of all types combined. And the Mustang wasn't alone. B-17s and B-24s poured out of Boeing and Consolidated plants. The massive Willow Run plant in Michigan produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. One factory outproduced the entire Japanese aviation industry. Supporting industries kept pace. Refineries in Texas and California churned out high-octane fuel in such abundance that American pilots were never told to conserve it. If a mission burned thousands of gallons more than planned, it didn't matter. More was waiting at the next airfield. Aluminum, steel, rubber, engines, radios, all flowed without pause. The arsenal of democracy was not a slogan. It was a daily reality visible in every glowing factory window and every crowded rail yard. Workers felt it too. Many of them had sons, brothers, or husbands flying the planes they built. A riveter in California knew her work might save a man's life over Tokyo the next morning. A machinist in Detroit knew his engine would roar inside a Mustang chasing down a Japanese interceptor. And unlike Japan, America could afford to lose planes and men. Though each loss hurt, each was quickly replaced. For every Mustang shot down, another sat waiting at a depot. For every pilot lost, another was training at a base in Texas or California. That morning over Tokyo, the difference showed. Japanese squadrons dwindled with every pass. But the Mustangs kept coming, steady, confident, knowing they had an entire nation behind them. The war in the Pacific was not just fought with courage. It was fought with factories, farms, and families. And no nation on earth had more to give than the United States in 1945. By mid-morning, the sky above Tokyo was a blur of contrails, smoke, and fire. The roar of engines echoed across the city as B-29s pressed on toward their targets. their shadows passing over neighborhoods, rail yards, and factories below. Lieutenant Saito's squadron had been reduced to fragments. One by one, his comrades had fallen, some consumed in mid-air fireballs, others spiraling helplessly into the bay. The rest turned away, fuel gauges dropping toward empty, engines coughing on their last fumes of potato alcohol and pine oil. Saito's own plane shuddered as he pulled out of a dive. He had fired his guns, but wasn't sure if he had hit anything. His ammunition was nearly gone, and his fuel gauge told the truth he didn't want to face. He had maybe 20 minutes left before the tank ran dry. Above him, the Mustangs still circled, darting in and out among the bombers with the patience of hawks. Their movements were smooth, deliberate, confident. Saito realized with a sinking heart that these Americans were not rushing. They weren't desperate. They had time, fuel, and ammunition to spare. One Mustang streaked past him, guns flashing, and another Japanese fighter vanished in smoke. Saito jerked his stick to avoid the wreckage. His plane rattled violently. The engine sputtered, then caught again. He knew he could not last much longer. As he pulled away from the fight, he looked back one last time. The sky was thick with silver bombers and their escorts, fires already licked at Tokyo's industrial districts. He could see smoke rising from warehouses, rail lines, and neighborhoods. It struck him with the weight of a hammer. This was not just a raid. This was the future. The Americans could come whenever they wanted, with as many planes as they wanted, and there was nothing Japan could do to stop them. His Hayate shuddered as he turned toward his airfield. The fuel needle quivered near empty. He prayed he could make it back, though deep down he wondered if there was any point. Even if he landed, what then? Tomorrow, the Americans would return. The day after that, they would come again. For Saito, the battle ended not in glory, but in exhaustion. His final thought as he guided his crippled plane back through the smoke was not of victory, but of inevitability. The empire he fought for was crumbling, and the men above him in silver Mustangs were proving it with every burst of their guns. Years later, long after the fires of Tokyo had burned out and the empire had surrendered, Lieutenant Saito would speak quietly of that morning in April 1945. He was an old man by then, his uniform long packed away, his memories softened by time. But when he spoke of the Mustangs, his voice still carried the weight of awe and of defeat. "We believed the ocean was our shield," he said, "that no American fighter could ever reach our homeland. But when the Mustangs came, we knew the war was already lost." For Saito and countless others, the shock was not only in the aircraft themselves, but in what they represented. Each Mustang was a message, written in steel and fire, that America's factories, farms, and people could outlast and outproduce anything Japan could muster. In the United States, men and women who had once built cars, radios, or refrigerators had transformed their labor into engines of war. Housewives became riveters. Teenagers tested radios, machinists built wings, and truck drivers hauled crates of parts to factories that never stopped running. It was not just machines that crossed the Pacific, it was a nation's spirit. The Mustang symbolized that spirit, a weapon born of democracy fueled by abundance and carried into battle by ordinary young men who believed they could make a difference. And for the Japanese who faced them, the realization was crushing. No amount of courage or skill could bridge the gulf between a nation running on scarcity and a nation running on plenty. Major James B. Tapp survived the war. Helen, the riveter in Inglewood, returned to her peacetime life. And Lieutenant Saito, who somehow managed to bring his crippled Ki-84 back to base that morning, lived long enough to tell his grandchildren the truth. That the day the Mustangs appeared over Tokyo was the day Japan understood its shield was gone. The war would grind on for months, with battles still to be fought and terrible weapons yet to be unleashed. But the message of that morning was unmistakable. The outcome was no longer in doubt. As one American pilot later put it, when the Mustangs reached Tokyo, the war was already over. The Japanese just hadn't signed the papers yet. And so, the story of the Mustang is not only about a fighter plane, it is about the power of free people working together, turning their creativity and labor into something greater than the sum of its parts. That, in the end, was America's greatest weapon. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think it must have felt like for those Japanese pilots to look up and see Mustangs over Tokyo for the very first time? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next episode as we uncover more untold stories from World War II. Stories of courage, innovation, and the human spirit in the face of history's greatest conflict. Because every story deserves to be remembered,